Kia ora. My name is Andrea, and as you can see here, our guest today is Jonathan Boston, and Jonathan will get to you in a second. Welcome to all of those who are back, who are returning, so you know what all of this is about. For those of you who are new, I'll give you a quick run through, and very warm welcome, of course, to our first-time participants. I hope you're going to enjoy it. So these webinars are part of a broader discussion about the future of public and community services. And our guests have drafted short chapters which will be included into a booklet as part of our progressive thinking booklets, and a new booklet that we are going to publish later this year. And we have done a number of booklets already, one on text, one on housing, and also one on the future of work. And what we usually do is that we run physical seminars usually in the Wellington PSA offices, and people are invited to discuss with some of the contributors. But this time round, COVID came, and we decided to move it to a webinar. And it has been proven successful. So thanks to all of you who are participating. And it's great fun, actually, as well. So this is a bit of background. And of course, you can find all of our booklets, our previous booklets online, as well as the chapters of our guests. And watch the space for further webinars, because we are doing them on a weekly basis until September. And also you can view the recordings on our website later on and check them out on Facebook as well. So I'm going to run you through the webinar, how we are going to do it. So I would like just to do a brief introduction at the beginning. And then Jonathan will present his ideas and share his ideas with you. And then we'll have a discussion or conversation, as always. And you are absolutely invited to post your questions by using the question and answer function. Please don't use the chat, use the question and answer function. And I would really appreciate if you could post reasonably short questions as well, because that makes it easier to build them into our conversation. Questions that have been, that I haven't managed to integrate into our conversation will be answered after the webinar. Our guests usually agree to give us answers afterwards, which we will then get to you. So it's worthwhile asking your question, even though it might not be answered in this webinar.
I'll do my best, Andrea.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I think we should get into introductions now. So a very warm welcome to you, Jonathan Boston, Professor of Public Policy at the Victoria University of Wellington. And Jonathan has published this wonderful book recently, Towards the Welfare State, Transforming the Welfare State Towards a New Social Contract. And that will form part of our discussion today, I understand, as well. But before we get into the contents of what we are going to talk about, we had a bit of a chat prior to this webinar, and I asked you what characterizes you, or the work that you are doing, why you're doing it, and to choose 3 words that characterize what you're doing or why you're doing it. And you chose wonder, love, and hope. So I would like to invite you to tell us a little bit about why you chose that words and what they mean to you.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and greetings, everybody. Andrea asked for 3 words, and that immediately set in mind the sort of Trinitarian context of my faith tradition, which is a Christian tradition. And one thinks of creator, redeemer, giver of life. But I was thinking, okay, how does that relate to my work? And these words, wonder, love, and hope, came to mind. So wonder, I think, is critically important. As human beings, we live in this extraordinary world, which is full of wonder. And as an academic, part of my responsibility and part of my joy is to explore and investigate this world and to take delight in discovery, in innovation, and so forth. So I think wonder is at the core of an academic calling. The word love, I thought, was highly relevant for the topic of today, which is the welfare state and its future post-COVID-19. In my view, love is really at the heart of what the welfare state is about. It is about care and concern and compassion for all citizens. Some people think that the fundamental sort of driver of the welfare state is justice, and justice in the context of sort of rational self-interest. But in my view, the fundamental foundation for justice is actually love, not rational self-interest. And if you try to build a foundation on rational self-interest, I think it will be it will be a cold and uninviting welfare state. And then the word hope, Andrea. We live in dark times. We live in dark times in terms of the future of democracy globally, with increasing surveillance, increasing autocratic rule around the world. We live in dark times ecologically. We have multiple ecological crises, not least climate change and biodiversity loss. And then we live in dark times in terms of COVID-19. And in that context, in my view, hope is critically important. And part of my task as an academic is to speak hope, I believe, into the situation. How can we improve on our policy frameworks? And there's some marvelous quotes that people have made about hope over the years. Martin Luther King, for example, said, "We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope." And Nelson Mandela said, "May your choices reflect your hopes, not your fears." And I think in this time, it is very easy to allow our fear to drive our thinking, not our hopes. And in my view, we need to be focused on hope now. Hope for a better tomorrow, hope for doing things that are going to improve the lives of people in the near term and for future generations.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that resonates with a lot of our participants here today. We are going now to talk about your thoughts for the welfare state. I'd just like to read out what it says on the back of your book. It says, 80 years ago, New Zealand's welfare state was envied by many social reformers around the world. Today, it stands in need of urgent repair and renewal. And you're arguing that we need a step up, that we need to change how we design and how we structure the welfare state here in New Zealand. So the floor is yours, round about 10 minutes, and okay. We are all excited to hear what you have to share with us.
Well, thanks, Andrea. So this is a very big topic. There are many issues, and I can only cover a few in the 10 minutes we have available. The book that Andrea has mentioned was published late last year, before the COVID pandemic was known about. And it was clear then that there were big issues that we needed to address to improve the effectiveness and fairness of our welfare state. But COVID-19 has kind of laid bare those problems, but also has created new problems as well. And what I'd like to do is to quickly run through some of the key problems that we have that were evident pre-COVID, note some of the problems that COVID-19 has generated or brought into sharper focus, and then think about the kinds of changes that we need to implement over the coming years. So if we stand back from the particulars, there seem to me to be three absolutely fundamental problems with the welfare state as it currently stands in New Zealand. The first is that the level of income support for many of our most vulnerable citizens is utterly inadequate, and that was highlighted graphically by the work of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group in recent times. They said many New Zealanders are living in desperate situations with existing income support arrangements failing to cover even basic costs for many people, let alone enabling people to participate and belong in society. And as a result, obviously, there is significant hardship and poverty. And I've done quite a lot of work on child poverty over the years. Unfortunately, COVID-19 will exacerbate the amount of deprivation and hardship in our community. And I know the government has been seeking to minimize that increase in deprivation and hardship. And I commend the government on many of the things that it's been doing. But nonetheless, unfortunately, the magnitude of the pandemic globally and its impact on New Zealand will inevitably increase financial insecurity, food insecurity, other forms of hardship. So that's the first problem. The second problem is huge, which is a multiplicity of quite serious issues in our housing markets. We have an inadequate supply of good quality, yet affordable rental accommodation. There are significant levels of homelessness and overcrowding with long waiting times and waiting lists for social housing. Essentially, we've got far too few social houses, and home ownership rates, which peaked about 3 or 4 decades ago, have been going down for a long time. And we now have a situation in which the overwhelming majority of Pacifica and a very significant majority of Māori are renters rather than owners. And for Māori, this means, in a sense, renting in their own country, the country in which they have been for 800 years or more. And I think we have to address the big issues in our housing market, and I appreciate that's going to take a generation to do. And the third problem is, it's a series of problems really, is that our welfare state is beset with injustices, inconsistencies, and perverse incentives. And just to mention a few, we don't have a principled and comprehensive approach to indexation across all forms of social assistance. Yes, there have been improvements. In recent times, the government has indexed benefits for the first time in 80 years to average wages. That's excellent. But many other forms of assistance, like the accommodation supplement and so on, aren't indexed to anything. Then secondly, we have a situation in which income support arrangements differ for those who suffer equally disabling accidents and illnesses. So, you know, if you get an illness and you need income support, you go onto the welfare system. If you're in work and you have an accident, you get accident compensation, and it's more generous. And that's an injustice in my view. If you take the healthcare system, there are a variety of issues, not least that dental services are poorly funded relative to many other forms of healthcare provision. You have a situation in which many families face very high effective marginal tax rates because of the design of our welfare support arrangements. You have a situation in which income is defined differently for policy purposes across the tax system and the benefit system and so on. You know, there are multiple inconsistencies and injustices of that kind. So there are these long-standing issues. Then COVID-19 has exposed, if you like, some additional problems, which include the fact that our sick pay provisions are wholly inadequate and often unfair, and they need addressing. It's exposed the vulnerability of many of our vital community services, and it's exposed the fact that we simply don't invest enough in active labour market policies. And the government has tried to respond to this. It's also exposed the fact that because we have a very heavily and highly targeted form of income support, if you're a couple and one of you lose your job, you're not eligible for any form of income support. And so you go from being a 2-income household to being a 1-income household. And in many situations, that can be a really brutal shock, particularly if you've got a large mortgage or you're paying a high rate of rental payments. So some big issues there, which the government has recognized through this COVID-19 income payment arrangement, albeit of a temporary nature. So big problems. How do we address them? Well, there are huge challenges in addressing them. The first is a fiscal challenge. Everything that we need to do is going to cost money. The second is time. Many of these problems are deep-rooted and are going to take a long time to resolve, particularly the ones in the housing market. And unfortunately, the electoral cycle of a 3-year parliament doesn't fit comfortably with addressing big long-term issues. And then there is the fundamental political challenge. We have a situation in New Zealand in which support for solidaristic policies, including progressive taxation, providing citizens with a decent standard of living if they're unemployed or sick, support for those sorts of things has declined since its high point in the 1970s and 80s. And that means it's politically more difficult for governments to spend more on the welfare state. And that needs to be addressed. And that requires, in my view, leadership and advocacy, but it also requires some changes in policy. And coming to the policy issues, Andrea, just very quickly, it seems to me there are 3 or 4 things that we need to do. The first is, in my view, we need to increase our reliance on universal or very lightly targeted forms of assistance and reduce our reliance on heavily targeted forms of assistance. And I think that will be politically popular because people tend to like universal assistance, and it helps get middle-class buy-in. If people who are middle to high incomes feel they're not eligible for assistance when they need it, it's not surprising that they then have a rather negative attitude towards those who do get assistance. So I think, while compassion is important, there also has to be kind of reciprocity. So that's one issue. Secondly, we obviously need to address the low level of core welfare benefits. And so I think there is a need for quite significant reform and some significant increases in welfare benefits. And then thirdly, and I'll perhaps leave you on this, I think we need to consider carefully with probably over several years, whether there is a case for a greater reliance on social insurance. And I'm happy to say more about that if people are interested, but basically we have with the exception of accident compensation in New Zealand, we have essentially a tax-funded system of social assistance, which involves flat rate payments rather than earnings-related payments, and relatively meager assistance in many cases. And it has a whole variety of problems, some of which I've mentioned, some of which I haven't. I think there is a case for at least considering the possibility of a greater reliance on social insurance for unemployment and perhaps for sickness. And I'm aware that a number of political parties are considering options in that area, both on the centre left and the centre right. So you've got ACT, as I understand it, taking an interest in social insurance. You've also got the Greens taking an interest in social insurance. And I think maybe it's time we had a serious debate about these matters.
Thank you so much. Well, fantastic. Thank you. So much to think about and to reflect on. I think my first, because you mentioned the idea of compassion and you talked about it early on as well in form of love, that is important to underpin, how we treat our fellow citizens and people living in New Zealand more broadly. And I was wondering about the principle of solidarity, which basically underpins the welfare state in European countries. How do you think that the idea of or concept of solidarity resonates with New Zealanders? Could it be a foundation to the welfare state here in New Zealand?
Very good question. I think the principle of solidarity does resonate with people, but I think it probably resonates in, how can I put it, different degrees at different times. So there's no question in my view that the experience of the 2 world wars and the Great Depression enhanced notions of solidarity, the sense that we're all in this together and everyone is kind of responsible for one another. We all have a duty of care to one another. And then as a result of the post-war period without major economic crises, without major wars and so on, I think notions of solidarity began to weaken, certainly here in New Zealand. The evidence points to that. And you had the rise of a much greater emphasis on individualism, individual well-being rather than perhaps collective well-being and so on. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has almost certainly heightened a sense of solidarity. We are all in this together, and we are all vulnerable, and we are all potentially carriers that could put others at risk, and therefore we all have to be responsible in the way we live our lives. So I think there is I mean, I don't have a lot of empirical evidence on this at the moment. I hope some people out there are perhaps doing some research on just how COVID-19 is affecting public attitudes to things like the welfare state and notions of solidarity. But my sense would be we are now in a more solidaristic context. But I'd also want to make the point that there are a number of things that need to kind of undergird and support the design and, if you like, the intellectual foundations for the welfare state. And one of them is this idea of reciprocity, a sense that you know, people should, if they can, contribute. And if you contribute, then you have a right to assistance. So if you have a context in which, at the moment in New Zealand, really certainly pre-COVID, if you're a couple and then one of you become unemployed, you're previously both working and one of you becomes unemployed, and the person who becomes unemployed is not eligible for any assistance because his or her partner is earning enough, there's a sense, I think, that many people feel, well, this is not right. I've been contributing through the tax system, and yet when I become unemployed, I'm kind of left in the lurch. So I do think the notion of reciprocity has to go hand in hand with the idea of solidarity, and probably some other notions as well. So we need to design our institutions in ways that have secure philosophical foundations, but which also recognize that there are multiple dimensions, multiple issues that need to be addressed.
And I think one of our participants asked about the difference between inequality and poverty as a way of, I guess, addressing certain injustices. But and he suggests that inequality might be the better focus or goal to attempt to deal with, rather than poverty, because it's a smaller and not a smaller kind of expression of, but part of the expression of inequality, I would say.
Okay, so Andrea, can I just quickly comment on that? So it's a good question. That there is, in my view, an important analytical and, if you like, philosophical distinction between poverty and inequality. I think most researchers on poverty would say poverty is essentially a threshold issue. You're setting some sort of line in the sand, which may be based on income, or it may be based on measures of hardship or deprivation. And you're saying below this threshold, whatever that threshold may be, you are poor, you're in poverty. Whereas inequality is about having more or less of something than someone else. And it's not so much about a threshold. And you can have an inequality of billionaires. You know, you can have a billionaire with 100 billion and a billionaire with 2 billion. Well, they're unequal. But now, you know, the billionaire with 2 billion is not poor. They're not in poverty, all right? So there's a distinction there which is important. And I think both poverty and inequality are important issues to address. I certainly think, in general terms, poverty is more concerning because the consequences for people are typically greater. So if you're talking particularly about severe and persistent poverty, then you've really got, you know, considerable hardship and deprivation going on. You've got people missing out on, you know, basic stuff. You've got people going hungry. You're going people without proper accommodation, maybe living rough, whatever. I mean, that is really serious, and that, in my view, should be a high priority to address. In terms of inequality, there are multiple forms of inequality. Of course, you've got ethnic inequality, gender inequality, you know, income inequality, inequality in healthcare outcomes, or quality of housing, and so on. And some of those forms of inequality are very, very important. Some of them perhaps not quite so important. You know, an inequality of you know, opportunities to go to Bali for a holiday, I'm not quite so concerned about. But if there's significant inequalities of it in terms of gender or ethnicity, then my view, that's more significant. And final comment is that, you know, both poverty and inequality are challenging issues to address. And there are going to be trade-offs and you know, costs and benefits from whatever you do to address them.
And I guess every redesign and kind of deconstructing and recreating a welfare state is linked to taxes and the funding of those services that welfare state would deliver. We have quite a few questions on those two issues, tax and funding. And I would like to relate that a little bit to what you talked about earlier, the decrease of targeted assistance, which I guess was exemplified by the previous government in its social investment approach. And now this government, to a certain degree, and now this government tries to pursue a well-being approach. Do you think that the welfare state can be considered within those kind of paradigms, or again, is it an expression of how a welfare state is used for certain purposes?
So some big issues here on Andrea. The first thing to say would be that the previous government, if anything, increased the degree of targeting rather than reducing the degree of targeting. And the current government, on balance, has reduced the degree of targeting, but not dramatically. And we've had these sort of subtle shifts between governments of the centre left and centre right now for, you know, for decades or so. So that's the first thing. In terms of social investment and social or sort of a well-being approach, the social investment approach of the previous government evolved over time. It started with a very strong focus on reducing the Crown's fiscal liability from having significant numbers of people on welfare benefits for a long time. And it was about how do you get people who are long-term welfare beneficiaries essentially back into work or off the benefit system somehow. And it evolved over time to perhaps a somewhat more sophisticated thinking about what are the best ways of intervening or tailoring services to small groups of people, but particularly people perhaps with multiple needs. And the social investment approach, frankly, was a very small part of the previous government's overall approach to social assistance or the welfare state, but it got substantially more attention than most of the other bits for a variety of reasons, not least because the former Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Bill English, was a very strong advocate of social investment. The emphasis on well-being of the current government, I would say, is a somewhat sort of broader approach. There is a problem that kind of well-being can be all things to all people. There's a multiplicity of things that contribute to well-being, and there's a multiplicity of determinants of well-being and a multiplicity of potential goals if you've got a well-being approach. I mean, my personal view is we should be concerned about people's well-being, and we should be seeking to enhance the well-being of people, both now and for the future. But we need to be very clear about the kind of thing we're focused on and what, if you like, objective measures of well-being matter most and therefore should be prioritized. And that's going to lead to debate. And we also need to not so much focus on well-being that we forget about other things, like principles of social justice, for example, or, you know, the fulfillment of basic rights. So I'm one of those people who, I'm a pluralist. From a philosophical point of view, I think there's a multiplicity of values that matter. We can't reduce everything to one sort of unit of currency, whether it's utility or welfare. On the contrary, we need to hold in sort of balance a whole variety of things which matter, which include, you know, truth and love and justice and community and fairness and so on and so on. I'm not sure if that's answered your question, Andrea. I've probably gone off on a bit of a tangent, but
No, thank you. Thank you. I'm quite interested in that idea of universal assistance, because there's this a concept being discussed, and it originated in, I think, 3 years ago in the UK, around universal basic services, which would mean that public and community services are maintained, are extended, and are further developed and offered for free to a greater number of people. And it seems to me that you would be in favor of such an approach. And I'm wondering how that would come about, and what it would mean for public and community services in New Zealand if we opted for that approach.
Okay, so again, some big issues here. We need to distinguish between the universal basic income idea, which is focused on income, cash, and the universal basic services approach, which is focused on services, essentially in-kind provision. You know, in broad terms, I'm in favor of having a set of universal basic services that are available to everyone, mostly free of charge. And I'm not in favor of universal basic income for a variety of reasons. But as soon as you start talking about a set of universal basic services, the question becomes, Andrea, which ones should be universal? So, you know, currently in New Zealand, we essentially have a universal system of compulsory education, free at point of entry. We have universal secondary healthcare services, again, free well, essentially to everyone. We don't have universal free primary healthcare services, and I personally would favour having free primary healthcare services. Then, of course, there's a range of other services. There's elder services, there's childcare, and so on. And here, you know, as we think about the fiscal cost of extending free services to people, we need to think very carefully about, well, what will the cost be, and what can we afford? What are the priorities? I certainly think COVID-19 has highlighted some issues in respect of childcare provision, issues which have been there for some time, but which need further attention. It's also highlighted issues around sick pay. Now, that may not be seen as a service. It might be thought more of the income side of things, but you know, we have relatively modest statutory provisions in relation to sick pay, which are not generous by any stretch of the imagination, and I think they need attention. So I'm sorry, I'm straying a little bit off services into the income side of things now, but I suppose a key point to make is that we need to think about all this holistically, thinking about the package of income and services that people need in order to live decent lives, in order to be able to meet their basic needs, and also have a sense of participation and belonging in society, that they're not excluded from the things that most people can do because they can't afford it. And therefore, Andrea, we need to think about the integration of the income side of things and the service side of things, because you know, you could say, okay, we'll charge for this service and we'll provide people with more income to pay for it. Or you could say, on the other hand, no, we'll provide this free and therefore not have to give people perhaps so much income. And so a holistic, integrated approach is essential.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks. A number of our participants are thinking about agency versus dependency, and in terms of the welfare state and what it might create by, you know, providing certain services or income support or whatever it might be. And what do you think how does a welfare state need to be set up in order to empower people and enable people to actually participate fully in society, rather than create dependencies on a system long term?
Well, again, this is a big issue. I think the word
only big questions today.
No, but these are all important. I think the notion of empowerment and participation are critical. So if we stand back again from the particulars, we should be designing our welfare state institutions so that they are humane, so that the access to services and the interaction between citizens and the service providers are positive interactions, supportive, encouraging, and not, you know, unduly punitive and negative and shaming and deriding and so on. So that takes us to, you know, big issues about how we design our incentive structures for the providers of services, both public and private. Clearly, when we come to the notion of empowerment and agency and so on, I think this is an area where a greater focus on active labour market policies is crucial. In the little note that I've written for this book, Andrea, I've highlighted the fact that New Zealand spends about half of what of the average, half of the OECD average on active labour market policies as a proportion of GDP. Other countries tend to invest far more heavily in a range of services to help people out of unemployment or people who are perhaps sick but able to work part-time. Other countries put a much greater investment into support arrangements, training arrangements, counselling, mentoring, and all that kind of thing. And I think we're going to, particularly in this COVID/post-COVID world, I think we're going to have to increase our investment there. And part of the aim isn't just about, you know, reducing the fiscal cost of unemployment. It's about empowering people to use their gifts and talents to the greatest extent possible, so that people can live fulfilling lives, people can contribute to society. Not many people like being unemployed or being dependent. I appreciate that some people have no choice because of their severe level of disability. But on the whole, for people who are able to contribute in paid and unpaid ways, we should be facilitating that and encouraging it.
Someone is asking about food banks and how they actually contribute to food insecurity. And that made me wonder about the interplay between charity and the welfare state. And I think it's very important to you know, get the right balance there, because charity is not democratically legitimated.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that interplay here in New Zealand and how you would think that would play out in the future, actually, under a redesigned welfare state.
All right, well, there's another big issue. I mean, my personal preference would be that we didn't need food banks. You know, when I was a child growing up in New Zealand, we had very, very few food banks. And then they exploded, particularly during the 1980s and 1990s. And the need has been great ever since. And I think that's a very bad mark on our society. You know, if I went back 40, 50 years, we had hardly any beggars. You know, we now have significant numbers of beggars, although by means of COVID-19, somehow we've managed to house them and take them off the streets. So I think we should design our welfare institutions so that basic needs such as food are provided, you know, people can afford them irrespective of their circumstances, and we've not done that now for a long time, and I find that disagreeable. At the same time, I think it's important to have civil society organizations, charitable organizations that can provide various kinds of services to people, which may not be necessarily, if you like, basic services, but nonetheless can be very helpful to people. So I think, you know, we should be designing our public institutions in a way that at least facilitates and enables a range of private initiatives and so on, and that actually probably encourages entrepreneurship of a commercial nature, but also entrepreneurship of a non-commercial nature, so social, you know, entrepreneurship. But if we go back to the whole question of, you know, universal basic services and having an income that is adequate, that covers basic needs, I think that's essential, Andrea. And if we could do that and kind of almost abolish the need for food banks, I would be enormously pleased.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. There are also a few questions around housing. You touched on housing before, and there are a number of questions around renting and why owning your own house here in New Zealand is so important and should be important going into the future. And maybe you can outline a little bit what you think needs to be done in the housing space. And how the welfare state would contribute to a better housing situation, or how it's interlinked, and why renting might not be an option. Or if so.
All right. So again, there are big philosophical issues here and policy issues. Let me just lay my cards on the table. I'm a kind of supporter of a property owning democracy in which people have a stake in their society, and that stake will be their human capital, but also some physical capital like a house and other assets. So sort of asset-based kind of welfare, if you like. I think there are very good reasons for having high rates of home ownership. It gives people a greater sense of security, a kind of a place that is their home. It reduces some of the challenges that people have if they're having to rent, which may be moving from place to place, which can be disruptive for families and education and so on, and for friendships. People can take pride in the home they own, which probably enhances the quality of neighborhoods and so on and so on. So I'm in favor of having high rates of home ownership, which we had, 40, 50 years ago. We had home ownership rates of over 70%, about 73, 74% in the early 1980s. And that was double what it was back in the 1930s. We went from about 50% to 74, 75% over the space of 50 years. And then we've gone backwards to about 60% now. The second thing would be to say we have a very small social housing stock in New Zealand by certainly European standards. It's around 3.5% of the total housing stock, 70,000 houses or something like that. We used to have social housing stock about 7% of the total housing stock. In Europe, it's often 12 to 15%. Now, if you have a large social housing stock, that of course affects the operation of the private rental market, probably in positive ways on the whole. And I think we should be both trying to encourage higher rates of home ownership, but also massively increasing our social housing stock, and thus reducing the reliance on private rentals. We have I think more than 50% of children in this country, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think more than 50% of children live in private rental accommodation. And private rental accommodation in this country, as many people will know, is often poorly heated, poorly insulated, inadequate in other ways, and insecure from a tenure point of view. And we have to say, is that great for childhood? I rather doubt it. So I think there's some big issues here. The problem is to radically increase our housing stock, our social housing stock, should I say, is going to take a generation. I mean, we would need to build something like 10,000 social houses a year for 10, 15 years or more to build it up to the sort of level that we need, maybe 200,000 or more social houses. And that requires long-term investment across multiple governments. And at the moment, we don't have a political consensus on that. If we could get that, that would be fantastic. But I'm afraid I don't see the National Party at the moment embracing an ongoing, really substantive investment in social housing. How to get high rates of home ownership again is going to be extraordinarily difficult given the high price of houses. Again, that's going to be a generational matter, maybe several generations. And it's going to require probably quite a lot of creative thinking, as well as obviously a massive housing build so as to restrain the overall house prices relative to incomes.
Well, thank you. We are getting to an end, unfortunately. We have so many more questions, so lots for you to answer after the webinar.
Right,
but
okay.
I don't want to leave you without asking what your guess is. How high are the chances that we can substantially reform the welfare state after the elections? What do you think?
Well, first of all, it's going to depend on whether we have a centre-left government or a centre-right government, and whether New Zealand First holds the balance of power or not. If we had a Labour-Green government, a majority Labour-Green government, I could see the potential for some significant changes to some aspects of our welfare state over the next parliamentary term. Perhaps not as much as I would like, but probably in the direction that I would welcome. If we have a centre-right government, if it was an ACT national government led by Judith Collins, sad to say, from my perspective, I think it would do almost the opposite of what I think needs to be done. And I suspect we would see even higher poverty rates, higher levels of inequality, and high levels of well, misery and deprivation, frankly. So that's sort of putting my political cards on the table, I suppose. If we have New Zealand First holding the balance of power, well, that will exercise a constraining influence in both directions, depending on whether it's a centre-right or centre-left government, I suppose. I suppose I'm just slightly optimistic that COVID-19 has highlighted our interdependence as human beings and the need for, if you like, going back to your word, solidaristic approaches, Andrea. And so I guess my hope is that notwithstanding the big fiscal challenges we're going to face, we may end up with a government that's willing to take some significant risks and do some creative and important reforms in relation to our welfare state, reforms that have long been needed.
Thank you so much. I mean, there was a wonderful final statement, I think. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts so generously. And I think, you know, lots to think about, lots of food for thought, and lots to reflect upon. And surely we will stay in conversation and yeah, keep an eye on the future and what happens. And it might be a brighter future after all. So
well, hope, Andrea, is
that's right. It never dies. That's right.
Hope informed by love and wonder. How about that?
That's right. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you very much to our very engaged audience as well. Sorry that I couldn't bring in all of your questions. We had quite a number of them, and we had quite an active chat here as well. So thank you so much for your contributions. And if you enjoyed it, please share on your social media and tell your friends about it, and come back next week. Next week on the 22nd of July, we'll have Deb Kawa and Dr. Amoya Bolton. And they will be talking about what will Maori policy and delivery look like in the future. So that should be another really interesting webinar to come. And yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And I will just say thank you and stay well.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Okay.